So almost everything that we do in life has a rhythm to it, including the music that we make. So let's today spend a little bit of time talking about rhythm inside of Psytrance. So I'm back in this project here that I also used for the last video, where we already have a bunch of different synths made. And in the last video, I didn't really go into the rhythm. That is really why I'm making this video here. I just put on this Rhythmizer 2.0 device here, which just generates the rhythm for me. And it does a really cool job at creating these random rhythms. That being said though, of course, you don't always want to just have a random rhythm. And even within these devices, there are a few things.
My name is Captain Flintlock, and with Talk Like a Pirate Day just around the corner, I think it's time for me to teach ye, and you, and all the other scallywags a few different things about talking like a pirate.
There are a few things that you can do to make the rhythm a little bit better and a little bit more interesting. Now actually, let's start with a new synth over here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just quickly going to open up a serum and quickly grab myself a tones from my tones pack. So in here, I'm just going to go with number 5 here, because I know it's a nice gritty FM sound. And that already sounds nice. Now usually when it comes to rhythms of these kind of sound, what I like to do is I just like to lay out a bar. So let's go like this. And let's write down a note. Let's go down 3 octaves to the right register. And the way that I like to think of it when I'm writing out my rhythm is really I'm trying to be the random device, but only for a bar. So I'm trying to get some cool ideas in here by just experimenting. The best way that you can do that is probably just laying down 16 notes like this. So this is going to be a very boring rhythm because it's going to be the same thing over and over again. This is just, repeating the same sound over and over, not really interesting. So what I would do at this point is I would just start changing some of the lengths to start off with. And that already has a massive impact. So making some of these 3 and some of these 1 long here, say that we do something like that, should already make it a little bit more interesting. But of course, another thing that you can do is taking some of these notes and making them so long that they overlap the next note and become a 1/8 note. So really, when it comes to creating my own rhythms, this is usually where the experimentation stops for me. Like I just come up with a 1 bar like idea here, and that just becomes the rhythm. So I duplicate this over, and then we get something like this. And to actually finalize the synth and mix it in with the rest of the track, I'm going to turn its volume down a bit. That's already nice. And then of course, in order to make this actually interesting and to give it a little bit of movement, you would go into the modulation here. So we have a filter that we want to modulate or automate, whatever you want to do. So let's say that we just draw up and down. We get something like this. So we already have a nice groove now, and of course we have the synth staying interesting because of its movement that it has. As you can imagine, once you start layering up a bunch of synths and layering up a bunch of ideas and actually start to develop how to drop, even a simple rhythm like this is just going to work. That being said though, it is still a little bit boring. So one of the things that you can do is you can consolidate an amount of clips that works well together. So say like 4 clips. The reason why we would go for 4 clips and not say something like 3 is because now we can take the 4 clips and duplicate them over nicely, and it will still fit in our 16 bar idea here. And that is generally speaking how music is counted in ideas of say 8 bars or 16 bars. Usually for Psytrance we tend to count in 16 bars or sometimes even 32 bars. So now what I can do is I can go in here and make some small edits to say this last part over here to make that part stand out. So let's say we make this note very long, and then we do 2 8th notes here, just so that it is very different from what we had before. We're just going to duplicate that over, and now we get something like this. Now, quick question before we continue this rhythm stuff. Have you subscribed to the channel? Are you leaving likes on my videos? Are you leaving comments on my videos? Have you ever gone to my Patreon page and checked that out? Maybe checked out some of my products? All of that stuff is a really great way to support the channel. And if you do any of that, thank you very much for your support. But with that said, I want to get back into rhythms. Now, as I alluded to in my last video, one of the things that most producers, especially most beginner producers that come in from a different genre into Psytrance tend to do is they start to think of this as a melody. So they start to think of it like, I don't know, doing something like this. Say we take this idea here and we'll duplicate over that a couple of times. You'll get something that sounds like this instead. That sounds a little bit off to me. I like it when it's in the root note and when it stays stable, because you have this modulation kind of going on top of it, and that being the thing that differs, the thing that is actually interesting. So what I would recommend for most beginner producers is to stick with synths that tend to stay in the root note, especially these kind of gritty synths, and a lot of particles do that. To be honest, most of Psytrance sound design tends to stay in the same key, in the root key. Of course, there's a few leads like an acid line or a Goa synth or something like that, like a melody with a big phaser on it and whatnot. That doesn't really benefit from doing that, but most synths benefit from just staying in the root note. And also, of course, staying in that very low octave, as you can see, D sharp 0 over here. So the 0 means that we have gone down 3 octaves from the default inside of Ableton. And that means that within the synth itself, I don't have to do any tuning. What you'll often see in other people's tutorials is that they do it like this, where they effectively have the MIDI higher and then they tune down their oscillators. I'm personally not a fan of tuning down oscillators. I prefer just tuning down the MIDI instead. So that's what I'm going to do, meaning that in the synth itself, I can just leave my oscillator on 0. And then, as I said, inside of Ableton, it means that you're going to trigger in D sharp 0. I believe other DAWs might count this differently. I know for a fact that FL Studio starts their default at 5 instead of 3 in terms of the octave numbering. So you would need to go down to an octave of 2 instead of an octave of 0. But you can figure that out quite easily by just listening to the texture and the tonality of it. This is the lowest part that you will go. If it becomes like almost farty in a way, then you know that you've gone too low. Anyway, so that is the most basic form of rhythm. Now let's have a look into something a little bit more complex, which is going to be grid synths, which means that I have to design a few grid synths really quickly, which I'm again going to do with my tones pack, just choosing a random one until I find a waveform that looks interesting, something like this, nice and gritty looking. Nice. I'll make my first grid synth out of a pluck. Like that, maybe 2 voices of unison, maybe 3, so that we have some stability in the center, and then we also have some stereo width. Nice. Gonna make another one by using another tones from my tones pack. Cool, that sounds nice. We'll move on to the next one. Again, using the tones from my tones pack. I'm just quickly making these. I could skip over this, but since I'm still talking, I'm probably going to leave this in the edit so that you quickly can see, you know, how effective the tones pack is at doing what it does, which is making quick sounds. I'll make a final sound here, which is going to be a squelch, which I'm just going to do, I guess, with a macro is going to be the easiest way to do this, because I do want to modulate it both up and down here in the idea that I have. So a squelch is made by having an opposing modulation on a bandpass versus the pitch here. So that's cool. Now let's look at what kind of rhythm you would come up with these 4 different elements. Because we can basically apply the theory that we saw before and just do it in here with multiple different elements. Of course, you don't want to just duplicate this over and just duplicate this here, here, and here. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create one unique rhythm with these 4 different sounds here. So what I'm going to start off with is this plug here. I think this is one of the more like stronger anchoring elements here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on the offbeat, which is generally speaking considered to be like a stronger beat. That is why offbeat bass works so well, for example. Quickly going to remove lower frequencies from actually all 4 of these things by just doing this. We can extend this to a bar and we can hear that, let's say that we put this on the first offbeat of every bar, we will get something like this. So we have our first plug in here, and now we would need to kind of counter that with some of the other synths that we have in here. What would be cool is to probably have a squelch in this whole beat here in terms of idea. So I'm just going to automate this up a little bit and then put this again down here. Of course, throughout the whole section, we're going to constantly change what this automation lane is doing here. But the rhythm of the sculpture is going to be the same. So this is going to be another anchor idea, I would say. And now we can go into the next one, which would be this one. So let's say that we want a little bit of a sound here. What you can see is that I'm mainly still working in 16 notes here. You can, of course, also introduce some 32 notes if you want to, by just making this half the length. And then duplicating it over here. You would need to make it shorter so that you can actually hear the distinct plucks. But generally speaking, I like myself a 16 note. You can put this over here to kind of double this idea up into 2 loops. So if I duplicate this over, you can see we have the same thing here. That's a very cool idea, but it's also interesting to have some elements which are different. And of course, we have another element with which we can fill in some other areas, say the offbeat over here and then over here. Honestly, without this last note, I like it a little bit more, having a little bit of that negative space in there where you deliberately put in some silence. So that it kind of gets pulled into this next area over here. What we could now do is duplicate this over once. As I said before, we're going to change this up so that the automation is different there. And then what I would like to do is maybe also just add a little bit of extra vibe to this by just making some small changes. Maybe just this one change is enough, this extra note here, to keep it interesting. In order for that flow to come out, what I'm going to do is I'm quickly going to add a LFO tool here. Actually, sidechaining like this has a massive influence on the groove that you're creating and on the actual feeling that you're creating for your sequence. So that would generally be how I would think about my grid synths and how I would just set them up. I guess the next stage that I want to talk about now is the stuff like Rhythmizer, the device that I showed before, which is this stuff over here. These are really cool because it allows you to just generate random MIDIs. Let's take again this synth over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new MIDI clip for it. And I am going to set down one note. Again, we'll go down 1 to 3 octaves. So now we have something that sounds really terrible because it's just going to play continuously. Honestly, you could put a gator plugin on this since you already have the filter modulation, but there's some cool things that you can do when you're doing it inside of MIDI. So that is what we're going to do. I'm quickly going to go to my Max for Live devices and I'm just going to put Rhythmizer 2.0 here. And by default, this is just going to chop it up into 16 notes. Apparently there's some 8 notes in here, even though the 8th note is turned down. That being said, what we can do is add some 8th notes and some quarter notes in here. And we already get a little bit more there. We can also randomize the length of the notes. So this is the randomization for the length here, and this is the overall note length. The final thing that I want to do, and for me the reason why this is so interesting, is we can randomize the velocity, which currently isn't doing anything because we haven't assigned it to anything. But let's say that we assign this to the remap, for example. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to extend that like FMiness a little bit. As you can see, if I do it like here, we're getting more squished in waveform. So you get a little bit of a different tonality doing that. And we'll just assign the velocity to the remap here. So now you get a few different cool tonal changes. And of course, finally, in order to finish off a synth like this, we would add our delay. And now we get something that sounds like this. Now, of course, this rhythmizer isn't the only device that you can use for this kind of stuff. I quickly want to shout out Altar of Wisdom, who makes some amazing devices for this kind of stuff. One of the cool ones that I really like is this auto grid thing here. So this is the receiver, and then here we have our main device here. So this is where you set all of the settings. What is cool about this is because it has like the sender part of it and the receiver part of it, you can set this receiver to any of the 8 channels here. And then what you can do is you can send different MIDIs to different channels, and it's actually only ever going to trigger one channel at a time. So this is basically automatically setting up this stuff for us, our grid synths for us, but it's still going to be based on the random rhythm, which you can set again here so that it loops, and say that you want a 2-bar idea here for a certain seed. We can just switch until we have the seed here. I don't have any for the synths of it, so I cannot actually play it, but this would continuously regenerate the same idea over and over again. The final thing that I want to talk about in regards to rhythms is some of the stuff that I'm doing in here. As you can see, this is a fairly complex example, but what we're essentially doing in this chain is we're controlling the arpeggiator here in a way that generates the rhythm for us. You can see that it's basically randomly being modulated to 16 notes. Sometimes we have a quarter note in here, sometimes an 8th note, sometimes we even have 2 32 notes. And then again, we're randomizing the velocity so that we can actually use that within some of the synths here. There's some other cool stuff that I'm doing. In fact, this is actually 8 different synths playing together, and I'm like switching between them in different interesting ways. But all of that is being controlled by this stuff over here. And the way that it works, let me just quickly close out of the instrument rack itself, because we don't really need that, nor do we need this. The way that this works is we're sending these 2 LFOs to these multi-multis here. The reason why there's multi-multis is because originally this was made on multiple tracks, so we don't actually need this anymore. We can disregard this as well. Essentially what we see is we have one LFO going through this remapper, and then we have another LFO going straight to the gate here. I believe in this case, input 2 is what is linked to the gate. We can see number 2 here to the gate, so that is true. Meaning that you can see that these are the settings that are controlling the gate here. And then this is the setting together with the remapper, which is making sure that we only get the note values that I want. We don't get a 1/12 note, we don't get a 1/6 notes, that kind of stuff. All of those options in between we want to disregard. And you can see that I've balanced it massively towards the 16 note. We have the chance of having an 8th note in here, a slight chance of a quarter note, and a very, very small chance of, in this case, 2 32 notes. The reason why it would be 2 32 notes is because we're regenerating every value every 16 note here, meaning that 2 32 notes will play before the next value is generated, which is actually exactly what we want because I never want to offset this by a 32 note. I always want these notes to be triggered within the 16 note rhythm that like Psytrance is known for, you know, the kick and bass doing this kind of stuff. That rhythm is what we want to keep. So that's another cool setup, basically making my own like rhythmizer or auto grids in a way. I personally like doing these kind of things because it gives me a lot of control over exactly how I want the sound to be. And I feel like it is a little bit maybe more personal than using somebody else's device that somebody else has created. But of course, you don't really have to do it this way if you don't want to. And I know that for a lot of people, creating your own MIDI triggering device is maybe a little bit too far of a reach. And for those people, of course, the devices are available, but also the earlier parts of this tutorial should be fairly interesting. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and making sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support the channel is to do so financially, mainly on my Patreon page, but also by checking out my products over on Gumroad or Payhip. So if you do any of those things, thank you very much for your support. But I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.